Tell me.
Rory, so we'll just start. I'll introduce you.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you today to this wonderful keynote that we have by Mr. Rory Sutherland. He's the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy UK. The theme of the address is an outrageous assertion, or is marketing much more important than we think? It's a very interesting topic. Before I hand it over to Rory, I'll just introduce him quickly. Rory has a very interesting background. Rory, as I have told you, is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, an attractively vague job title which has allowed him to co-found a behavioral science practice within the agency. Before founding Ogilvy Change, Rory was a copywriter and creative director at Ogilvy for over 20 years, having joined as a graduate trainee in 1988. He has variously been president of the IPA, chair of the judges for the direct jury at Cannes, and has spoken at TED Global. He writes at regular columns for The Spectator, Market Leader, and Impact, and also occasional pieces for Wired. He's the author of 2 books, The Wiki Man, available on Amazon, and the best-selling Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas, which don't make sense, which many of you may be acquainted with. Very interestingly, Rory is married to a Vaika, has twin daughters of 18. He lives in the former home of Napoleon III, unfortunately in the attic. He's a trustee of the Benjamin Franklin House in London and a patron of the Rochester Cathedral. Rory, without further ado, I hand it over to you. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I thought I'd spend my half hour with what is, to most people, I think, an outrageous and ridiculous assertion, which is that it's perfectly possible that the biggest constraint on economic growth, particularly in developed economies, is no longer anything to do with supply. It's no longer anything to do with production. It's actually demand. And that most problems may in fact be marketing problems in disguise. And let me explain this. Before, I wondered whether this was true, and I've long wondered whether this might be true, but working as I do in advertising, it seemed a ridiculously self-interested and self-centered belief to think that really what the world faces is mostly marketing problems. And that obviously, that all the problems of kind of supply and distribution are actually more or less solved, and that all that remain are actually problems of human behavior. And I've recently come across a few economists who effectively believe the same thing. So I'm not entirely alone in this. There's a very good Italian economist called Mario Fabri, who was for a long time the chief economist of Ferrero. And he looks at American economic growth, and he says that if you look at the growth of the United States, it's been at a fairly constant sort of 2%, with a little bit of unevenness for decades. And his suggestion is that other countries can grow faster because to a large extent what the people are doing is copying the behaviors that already persist in the United States. But at a high level of development, what actually slows economic growth is not the availability of new products and services. It's actually the mental capacity of consumers to adopt them. Now, just to be clear about this, Peter Drucker, the great marketing guru, said something very similar when he said that in developed economies now, the big issue is not really a shortage of goods or a shortage of raw materials. The real constraint is actually a shortage of customers. That was his 20th century observation. And I think we've all very recently had a very interesting lesson in how this might possibly be true, which is most of us, I think, after COVID ends and after lockdown ends, and in the hopeful event that some sort of vaccine becomes developed, most of us won't go back completely to our pre-existing behaviors. Now, I'm yet to prove that, but I think I'm fairly confident it's true, because something very strange has happened, which is that most people in business too have remarked that there are aspects of the lockdown which they've actually liked. They've liked the fact that you video conference much more and that you travel much less. They find their lives more pleasant, less stressful, and in many cases, possibly a majority of cases, of the clients I speak to and of my colleagues, they actually find themselves more productive than they were before. But what's interesting about this is that nothing's changed about Zoom or WebEx. Nothing's changed about the price. Nothing's changed about the technology. All the technology that was necessary to do this beforehand already existed 3 or 4 years ago. The trouble was that 3 or 4 years ago, nobody used it to this extent. And not using it, they never really realized or discovered the potential which it offered. And I would argue that John Stuart Mill writes quite a lot about this, funnily enough. When he talks about liberty, he says there is a liberty which is curtailed by government, by legislation, by laws, but just as great a curtailment of liberty comes from the behavior of other people and the expectations and the norms and the social opprobrium that other people may actually exert on you if you behave in a different way. And what he's talking about there really is that social norms exert a very, very large power. We're not always conscious of them in the same way that we might be conscious of a law when it prevents us doing something we'd rather do. But nonetheless, they're very, very powerful forces in human behavior. And before lockdown, if you think about it, a large amount of business activity and a very large amount of B2B activity, I would say, is something that anthropologists would describe as performative. You flew to Frankfurt not because you couldn't have dealt with the whole matter over the telephone or over Zoom, but you flew to Frankfurt to show how eager you were to visit your client and what a commitment you were making. You hosted, elaborate presentations in your building with food, not because it was the most efficient or cost-effective way of doing so, but because it was an expectation. That pre-lockdown, there was simply a mental state that persisted around the use of video calling and video conferencing, that it was kind of the poor alternative, and that you felt that actually if 3 of your competitors flew to Frankfurt and you suggested a video call, you would look insufficiently eager to capture the business. And so it was really a product of convention, a product of behavior. It was nothing to do with the things economists normally talk about, which is supply and demand and price and rationality and all those things. And so we have the strange thing which economists more or less say should never happen, which is that essentially people might find themselves sometimes happier if temporary constraints are imposed, because the constraints enable them collectively to get to a new equilibrium, which would take much longer to reach if you left everybody to their individual devices. So there's an interesting philosophical question here, which is, can we sometimes be happier under constraints? So, for example, I've argued that the lockdown makes the case for road pricing and road rationing fairly strongly, because most of us have suddenly realized that we now make far fewer journeys. But when we do make a journey by car, the roads are correspondingly much emptier, and the quality of the journey and the certainty of the time of arrival is much, much higher. And I think most of us would say, do you prefer that trade-off? And as I jokingly said, look, we make the trade-off between quantity and quality all the time. We trade off a certain amount of quantity in order to enjoy higher quality, which is why most of us drink wine or beer or whiskey rather than meths. Okay, life isn't just about the quality of things, it's about the quantity. And suddenly people have realized that if we all collectively travel a bit less, we make slightly fewer unnecessary journeys, but the journeys that are important to us and the journeys we still have to make are actually quite pleasurable rather than having experienced Hyderabad traffic for a week, rather than being fairly chaotic. London's not much different, to be absolutely honest. And so that interests me. And it's worth remembering this isn't simply a question of conventional marketing, but what it is a question of is of ignoring the mainstream assumptions of economics, which is that supply creates its own demand, and that the only constraints to economic growth, are physical or economic, financial, they're not psychological. And let me explain for a second why it is that I think that even if my thesis isn't quite right, even if marketing isn't the primary constraint to economic growth, social and societal progress and discovery, for example, it's still much, much, much more important than most mainstream economic policymakers think, and certainly more important than most economists think. And it's worth remembering this and reminding yourself of this. If you've done an MBA, if you've done an economics course as part of the MBA, what you will have been taught is effectively mainstream, neoliberal, neoclassical economics. Okay. And it took me a few years to notice, as someone working in advertising, I often ask the question, why is it that our job is so difficult? Okay. Not just my job, but the job of the marketing director, the job of the marketing client we work with. Why do they find it so difficult to sell marketing ideas and to sell marketing investment? And I suddenly discovered that most of the people they're talking to, let's say in finance, or the chief executive, who is often a former finance director, many of the people they're talking to have a background, a mental frame, if you like, in neoliberal mainstream economics. And just to remind you of that, if you haven't gone through this particular indoctrination in economic models, mainstream economics makes a series of extraordinary assumptions in order to make itself mathematically neat, elegant, and tractable. And it assumes there's this single thing called utility, okay? And it assumes that utility is what everybody is seeking to maximize. Well, that's not totally crazy to begin with. But let me look at some of the assumptions it makes about the people who are seeking to maximize their utility. The assumption is, and I'm not making this up, okay, that each of those people in any mainstream economic model is possessed of perfect information, stable and transitive preferences, and perfect trust. So the assumption is that the entities, the artificial organisms which populate any economic model, know exactly to the penny what products and services will satisfy their needs most optimally. Okay? They know exactly to the penny how much they're therefore prepared to pay for any of those goods or services. And they completely trust the person who is selling them those goods and services. So you have a world of perfect information and perfect trust. And I don't think you need to think long and hard to realize that that's not a very realistic representation of the modern world. But if you think a bit harder still, you realize that in that imaginary world, marketing wouldn't need to exist. Okay, I freely admit this. If I found myself in a world where the economic model was an accurate depiction of social reality, my job wouldn't exist. You wouldn't need advertising, you wouldn't need marketing, because everybody would already know what they wanted. They know exactly how much they were willing to pay for it. And it would simply be a matter of customers and businesses, or customers and innovations, finding each other automatically through this magical mental power of which economics assumes they're possessed. And I suddenly realized that there are inordinate problems that come when you look at this world. For one thing, never mind the fact that you completely ignore the power of marketing. That's a problem, because it's a world without marketing. It's a world where marketing has no function and no value. The second problem you face, I think, is that as a result of seeing the world through this model, you essentially will regard marketing as a cost and not a source of economic value creation. You won't see it as a contributor to the value of your product or service, something that makes your product or service something that people are willing to pay more for. You won't see it as a source of value. You'll see it as a necessary evil, a cost to be minimized. That's the best, that's the best way you can see it. And then there's a further problem, which I think is very, very acute in business. And anybody who's worked in business, actually anybody who's attended a board meeting will recognize this. In that world, the only way you can change the fate of your business is basically to make your product materially better, i.e. more utility, not perceived utility, real utility. So you've got to invest more in the objective characteristics of your product, or you've got to reduce the price. And those are the only two levers you can pull. Effectively, utility, objective utility, and price are the only two levers you can pull to make a difference. So I would argue that businesses brought up with this philosophy are overly preoccupied with price reduction. I think they're just excessively focused on the gains they think will arise if they actually reduce price. Now, I think this is actually incredibly important, because you suddenly realize that economics, even when it's not wrong, okay, and I'm not suggesting that it's wholly wrong about everything, but even when it's not wrong, it's unbelievably creatively limiting. And it's particularly creatively limiting because it completely fails to acknowledge that it's possible to perform a kind of magic in value creation. Now, there are economists, I hasten to add, who disagree very violently with the neo-classical model. One group, by the way, and this is, I think, of relevance, my contention is that, put it very bluntly, if your finance director hates it, it's probably good marketing. Okay? Because finance directors think in economic terms and they tend to see marketing as a cost, and they tend instinctively to hate it because it's actually extrinsic to their model. Okay? If you're thinking of doing something which your finance director probably hates, then there's a very high chance what you're doing is actually very effective marketing. Okay? And it's worth remembering that I would argue that marketing, and Drucker said this, is a branch of economics. But patently, the branch of economics where marketing sits is not mainstream neoliberal, neoclassical economics, because neoliberal economics is completely marketing free. And so my argument is that, strangely, marketing effectively has something to learn from any branch of heterodox economics. That might be Austrian economics, evolutionary economics, ergodicity economics, which I might talk about later if I have time. Certainly Austrian school economics. Now, interestingly, the Austrian school of economists, and this includes people like Schumpeter, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, for example, they have a completely different belief. First of all, it's very little taught because the Austrian school don't really believe in the use of maths in economics, because they don't think mathematics represents human preference. Now, as a result, if you do believe in Austrian economics, it's very difficult to get a job teaching it, because most of economics teaching is both taught, focused, and examined on mathematical concepts. Okay. But Ludwig von Mises said something very interesting about marketing and advertising. He said that there is no useful distinction to be made between the value created in a restaurant by the man who cooks the food and the value created by the man who sweeps the floor. And by the man who sweeps the floor, he explicitly means marketing and advertising. He says so. And his point is that you manufacture a meal, but the enjoyment of the meal and the consumer's readiness to pay for the meal, and in particular, the consumer's readiness to repeat the experience, is not only dependent on the objective quality of the food, it's dependent on the context in which it's served. There's a very interesting school of marketing called service dominant logic, which argues that the whole of economics, by the way, makes the mistake of basically focusing on products rather than services. And they argue that actually service dominant logic forces you to ask much more intelligent questions, like, will people actually come back? Which is, if you run a restaurant, unless you're a tourist restaurant where you don't care if people come back, that's why tourist restaurants are by and large usually rubbish, because they buy real estate with an attractive view and they rely on everybody visiting the Parthenon to go and sit there and have a meal there once. But until TripAdvisor came along, there was no particular incentive for them to be any good. You probably tried not to kill your customers, but there was no incentive to be particularly good because hardly anybody was ever going to come back anyway. And so it's a really important point, this, that he says that, you know, the man who sweeps the floor, the man who creates the context in which it's possible to enjoy the food, is just as much responsible for creating value as the person who cooks it. And in fact, it's probably easier almost to destroy a restaurant through a bad experience. If you serve Michelin quality food, but the restaurant smelled slightly of sewage, or that the points on the prongs on your fork were not quite aligned, or whatever, you can ruin very, very good food with very slightly bad context. And you can ruin very, very good products with slightly off marketing. And it's a really, really important thing to understand this, that actually human perception is not remotely objective. Now let's pause for a second to look at this. We know all brain science tells us that people perceive the world relatively. They perceive the world contextually. That even applies, and wait a second, my telephone is ringing. There we are. That even applies to price, okay? So whether something is expensive or cheap doesn't only depend on how much it costs, the dollar amount, it depends on what you compare it to. So price is a function of marketing. It's not a function of cost. And you're going to go, this guy's crazy, right? Okay, let me give you two examples. I'll give you one very small example. My father, who's now 90, my father 10 years ago refused to get satellite television at home. He only had 4 channels and one of them was in Welsh, and he doesn't speak Welsh at the time. And I said, look, you don't like films, I get that. You don't like sports, you're not remotely interested in the sport, but you're very interested in documentaries and news and factual channels. I said, look, for only £17 a month, you can subscribe to the Sky Learning Pack, and it will give you 15 news channels and about, I don't know, 120 documentary and factual channels, you know, true life crime, wildlife, history, you know, History Channel, the Smithsonian Channel, PBS, etc. And he said, it's too expensive. And I said, well, don't worry, I'll pay for you, because I'm not that mean. I said, I'll buy it for you as a present. He said, no, it's still too much money. You know, I don't want you spending all that money on that. And then I tried a simple Don Draper mind trick. I said, well, when you think about it, I said, it's not £17 a month, it's 60 pence a day. Now, those of you who are astute mathematicians will know that 60 pence a day is actually a little more like £18.50 a month. So in objective terms, by saying 60 pence a day, I'd put the price up. And he said, well, he's quite good at maths, my dad. He said, what difference does that make? What's the difference between 60p a day and £17 a month? I said, you spend £2 a day on newspapers. He does. He gets 2 broadsheet newspapers every day, the Telegraph and the Times mostly, I think. And I said, that's all you need to think, okay? If you spend £2 a day on broadsheet newspapers, is it that crazy spending 60 pence more, in other words, another 25% on top, to get 200 factual channels and 15 live news channels? Okay, we even get ND24 here actually as well, okay, which he occasionally watches. And he said, oh, I see what you mean. Without me having to pay, he went and subscribed. He went and took out a subscription 2 weeks later. And he's now 10 years on, he's the biggest advocate of satellite television among the nonagenarians of the Wye Valley. He's going around to all his friends saying, I can't believe you still haven't got Sky Plus. Let's take a look at Nespresso, an extraordinary business, wonderful billion-dollar business. I think it's the Swiss Apple, I describe it as. It's a fantastic innovation. You couldn't get people to buy Nespresso in a jar, because if Nespresso came in a jar, people would compare it to the cost of Nescafe or Maxwell House, or they'd compare it to the cost of tea. And they look at it and go, this is just insane. It's like, you know, I can't pay £30 for a jar of coffee, because per unit of caffeine, that's roughly speaking what Nespresso would cost. But it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in a pod. And because it comes in a pod, and each pod costs about 40 pence, I suppose about 40 rupees, okay? Your frame of reference is no longer Nescafe or Maxwell House. Your frame of reference is Starbucks. And I've just got a double shot 80 pence Nespresso coffee in front of me now, because it's a bit earlier in the morning here than it is with you. And I'm not thinking, my goodness, that's actually, you know, 30 times more expensive than a coffee I could have had. I'm thinking that cost me 80 pence, but at Starbucks, the same thing would have cost me £3.20. So I'm actually saving money every time I take a sip. And so never mind products being subjectively perceived, even price is perceived subjectively. And the way you price things and the way you change things is affected as much by the psychological presentation as it is by the objective reality. And so here's my basic contention, which is that if you look at what most businesses do under the influence of economics, most business metrics, most of business is really an effort to look scientific, okay? Because if you can pretend your decisions are scientific, they never are. Business is like weather forecasting, right? It's a chaotic, complex system. But if you can pretend it's like Newtonian physics, okay, then you'll never get fired for making a decision because you look rational. Always remember that in business, two things, right? One, it's much, much easier to get fired for being irrational than it is to get fired for being unimaginative. A failure of the imagination, a failure to spot an opportunity is not a firing an offense, but a failure of logic is. And so in the effort to make business look like science, most of the metrics we measure in business are objective metrics, okay? We measure time, distance, weight, size. Humans don't care about these things at all, okay? We're often trying to objectivize or to optimize completely the wrong thing. What humans care about is, and this is not a complete list, it comes from David Rock, a very brilliant New Zealand neuroscientist. What humans care about is, apart from sex, food, and other basic survival things, above that level, it's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, okay? Now, let me give you just two examples of this. I think if you look at most billion-dollar businesses, and you look at Uber, okay, you look at Google, you look at Amazon Prime, you look at, I've just mentioned Nespresso, okay. I think most of those businesses, Apple being an obvious case in point, Dyson, Red Bull, okay, none of those businesses make sense from a rational point of view, okay. If you'd ask a conventional business to found that business, how would you ever, in a soft drinks company, get your colleagues to agree to trial launch Red Bull, which costs a fortune, comes in a tiny can, and which, when researched, almost everybody said they despised the taste, okay? Where was the evidence, rational evidence, that there was a market for a $500 vacuum cleaner before Dyson came along? There was absolutely none. Now, what Apple did, and what all those companies do in some way, and I'll talk about Uber in a second, is they're closer to focusing on subjective metrics, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, than they are on objective metrics. And I'll give you two examples, okay? When the first iPhone came out, I was with a bunch of very senior people at Nokia, and they were all slightly laughing at the iPhone because they were judging it on its objective characteristics. And in particular, they were laughing at the fact that it had very, very short battery life. But what they were focused on was the things that businesses and scientists focus on, which are SI units plus money, okay? And generally what they're focused on is things like processor power, battery life, clock speed, memory capacity, screen size, all that stuff, okay? What I think Steve Jobs did, which made him the author of $1 trillion company, okay? What he did was this. Instead of asking the question, what can this phone do? He asked a more subjective, emotional question, which is, what does it feel like while you're doing it? If you look at Uber, the extraordinary success of Uber, do you remember that of that scarf mnemonic? The C stands for certainty, okay? Now, for very obvious evolutionary reasons, we really, really hate uncertainty. In fact, the degree of uncertainty experienced in any given exchange is much, much more closely correlated to consumer happiness than actually the objective measure of the thing itself. So nearly all taxi firms would be measuring how long it took for a taxi to turn up against happiness. Because nearly all business decision making is derived in its assumptions from consumer behavior, from two things. One of which is economic theory, which is that objective factors really matter because consumers are making their decisions on objective grounds. And the other one is market research, which faces another problem in psychology because we don't know why we feel the way we do. As David Ogilvy said about market research, the trouble with market research is people don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. And the reason for that is we don't have introspective access to the reasons for our mental state. And so most people will say, I like my taxi to arrive early. I don't like it when my taxi's late. But what they won't spot is that what they really hate about the wait is not actually the delay, the duration. It's the period of uncertainty, because we've evolved as humans to imagine the worst in any uncertain situation. It's a good survival instinct to imagine the worst, but it's a painful mental experience. What Uber did is they solved the problem not by reducing the duration of the wait, but by completely transforming the experience of waiting by dint of completely reducing the degree of uncertainty, okay? And so what they did was they put a little car on a map. Now, there's a little bit, by the way, I'm going to add a little detail to this. There's also a touch of status in that as well. Because now, instead of standing on the pavement in front of all my colleagues going, is that my car over there? Oh dear, it's raining, my car hasn't turned up. I can actually time my arrival onto the pavement to coincide with a car drawing up, which makes me feel like Louis XIV, okay? It makes me feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects. But there's also that glorious thing, which is previously I'd spend 5 to 10 minutes in a state of, oh God, where's this car? I bet it's not going to turn up. They probably lied when they said 10 minutes. Why isn't it here now? It should have been here by now. And instead, I'm looking at a map going, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll make myself a cup of tea while I'm waiting. And so the objective duration can be the same, but the emotional experience can be totally different. And business, with its attempt to look scientific and to kind of try and cram itself into an economic model, is disproportionately focused on technical innovation rather than psychological innovation. And we call this innervation, I-N-N-E-R. Innovation, mental moonshots, innovation where you transform a human experience of something, not by changing its objective qualities, but by doing something different within the head. That's what I did to persuade my dad to get Sky, okay? Now, when you think about it, there are two ways you can really improve. This is going back to Peter Drucker, okay? Peter Drucker says there are only two things in business that actually add value: marketing and innovation. Everything else is a cost. And when you think about it, marketing and innovation are actually two sides of the same coin, because there are two ways you can add significant competitive advantage and value to a marketplace. You can either work out what people want and find out a way to provide it, or you can work out something you can make and find a brilliant way to make people want it. Now, the final loss that you pay, the final price you pay when you believe in economics is that once you believe in economics, it's modeled on physics, you can't believe in magic, okay? You know, physics, economics is modeled on physics, physics is modeled on that very rare set of things within the universe where 2 or 3 objective metrics can describe the behavior of the whole system, okay? Now, physics is very, very good at doing what physics does, but patently, atoms and human beings are not at the same level of complexity, okay? The great thing about complex systems is, unlike physics, magic is possible. There are butterfly effects. We've tripled the conversion rate of a business by adding 1 or 2 sentences to the call center script. But also, you can actually perform wonderful magic by just telling stories about things, which makes people think about things. Maybe it's the price, maybe it's the quality of the product, in a completely different way. And what you can actually do is you can turn a weakness into a strength. I'm going to end with this. Let's look at some of the greatest advertising end lines of all time, okay? How else can a month's salary last a lifetime? That's "A diamond is forever." It's probably the greatest headline ever written in my book. Okay, before that campaign, by the way, diamonds were generally decorative sideline gemstones. The reason we think of the diamond as the ultimate, what you might call, carboniferous form of value is more a product of marketing than it is a product of scarcity, by the way. There are other gems, rubies, sapphires, and things, which are considerably more scarce, okay? There's actually no scarcity at all. Tons of the bloody things control the market. Anyway, okay, now, the second thing is, okay, let's look at other ones, okay? Reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois, or we're number 2, so we try harder for Avis. The point is that people perceive things according to the nature of the attention they pay to them. And if you change the frame or the context in which they look at something, their entire conception of utility and value changes. And that enables you to perform a kind of magic. Now, if we look very finally, okay, I'm not suggesting that marketing is all about advertising, not for a second. It's not all about storytelling. But the real issue nowadays, it's not that solar panels aren't efficient enough or aren't cheap enough. It's that you can't get people to put them on the damn roof. It's not that electric cars aren't ready for mainstream. It's that people are still worried irrationally about things like range anxiety. Most of the obstacles to growth and progress lie outside the realm of mainstream economics, of supply, demand, and price. That's not to say they're purely marketing problems, but a hell of a lot of what we think of as objective problems are really marketing problems in disguise. And I'll leave you with one simple fact. In London, Transport for London, the single best thing they've done to improve passenger experience per pound in the last 20 years doesn't involve anything objective at all. It's not faster, more frequent, more reliable trains. It's not more comfortable trains. It's not later running trains. No, it's dot matrix displays on the platform. Because psychologically, we're much, much happier waiting 9 minutes for a train when we know it's coming in 9 minutes than waiting 5 minutes for a train when we don't know when it's going to arrive. Now, an engineer would try and solve that problem by making trains more frequent. A marketer would simply put up a sign. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Rory. It was amazing listening to you. Time for 2 or 3 questions, if it's possible.
Yes, of course. I'd be delighted.
Okay. So you spoke a lot about, utility-driven companies, recently, others. Now, what's your take on companies in the developing market, where consumers are very conscious of price?
Yes. Now, by the way, you call India a developing market, but I mean, what? More people in India, I would argue, than in Britain, in simple numbers, are in the stage where essentially your income is discretionary. And it's worth remembering that mainstream economics had its origins in the 18th century, where most people in England were actually objectively poorer than most people in India are now by some measure. So where essentially most people spent their money on staples, and where you could assume demand, okay? Because the demand was satisfying directly innate instincts like hunger, okay? And although it's worth remembering that even in the 18th century, we had what were the first multinationals? And actually it was tobacco, coffee, tea, opium as well, better draw a veil over that, okay? But it was actually, if you think about it, those things have no role for survival. They're actually bought for psychological purposes. Those are all things that are bought for how they make you feel. Okay, so even then in the 18th century, there was tea is actually, inefficient water. If you're purely looking at it from a human survival point of view, then, quite a lot of goods are luxury goods. There was a great advertising man who, when somebody said advertising makes people want things they don't need, he said, look, every day a human being needs 1,500 calories, 2 liters of water and a warm, dry place. Everything else is a want. Okay. Now, so even I will contend that even among people who are cash constrained, I'm not talking about people who are desperate to survive, who are actually hungry, because for obvious evolutionary reasons, our hunger instinct, if we're really, really hungry, triumphs over status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. Okay. So if we're actually hungry, but it's equally true to say that even among the highly cash constrained, these things still matter a great deal. And you might argue, by the way, that certainty, I haven't got time to go into this in my talk, but certainty matters more when you're poor than when you're rich. If you're rich, you can afford to buy a product that isn't actually that great, okay? If you're poor, you can't. One of the reasons I think we've always got brands wrong, because we think that people are trying to maximize utility rather than trying to minimize uncertainty, we fundamentally misunderstand the role that brands play in customers' lives. And people don't buy brands because they think they're perfect. They buy them because they're sure that they're pretty good. And I always say that McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world, not because it's brilliant at being fantastic, but it's incredibly good at not being terrible. Okay, so you go there and you know that you won't get ill, you won't get ripped off, the food will be reasonably tasty, everything will be pretty much okay. And when we're paying, $100 more for a Samsung TV, what we're really paying for is not the perfection, it's the confidence that this TV is going to be somewhere between great and pretty good. What we can't afford is the 5% risk that it's terrible. And this is actually ergodicity, which is that under multiplicative dynamics, reducing variance is the best life strategy. Okay, but economists see everything as a one-shot game, so they look at maximization as the optimal approach. But we don't have enough information to maximize, and therefore, under conditions of uncertainty, the most sensible evolutionary instinct is to minimize variance. So confidence, trust is actually more important if you're poor than if you're rich. That's why, by the way, in Britain, richer people are more likely to buy supermarket own brand things, and poorer people are more likely to buy branded goods.
Oh, that's very interesting, Rory. Rory, so another question that we have, since you mentioned trust, with rapid unlocking of industry and life around the countries, how best can brands enforce consumer trust, and how important is it in business decisions?
It's everything. In fact, there's somebody at the World Bank who has produced a model which suggests that actually the extent to which you can engage in transactions in an atmosphere of trust. Now, in any transaction, there's information asymmetry. Now, a man called George Akerlof actually won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1975 for a paper on precisely this, that when you have too great a level of information asymmetry, in other words, people aren't sure what they're buying, okay, What happens actually is worse than the fact that some people don't buy. It's that the entire market ceases to exist. And I actually advanced an interesting theory there, which is that about 20 years ago, there was one such market, which was a brilliant, brilliant idea. And unfortunately, it was such a brilliant idea, it was very profitable. And because it was very profitable, a lot of dodgy people got involved in it. And that was a thing called timeshare. I think timeshare was a brilliant idea. This is where you, instead of owning a second property, you bought the rights to use a property for 2 weeks or 3 weeks of the year, by the sea typically, or in Spain or whatever. Nobody wants to have a bloody flat in Spain the whole year. You're not going to get there more than maybe 6 weeks of the year. So timeshare was a glorious idea. It was halfway between renting and buying. And I think what happened with timeshare is the whole market got destroyed because there were too many bad actors there. And I can see that happening, by the way, around, do read, it's called The Market for Lemons, George Akerlof's paper. And fascinatingly, it's probably the most important paper in economics in the second half of the 20th century. But when he submitted it to economics journals, people said things like, but if this were true, economics would be different, okay? And it's the first attempt from someone. He's totally wrong about the solutions, Akerlof, by the way. He hates advertising. But the point is that advertising is a way of establishing trust precisely because it's expensive. Because if you've invested up front in your reputation, you have more skin in the game and more to lose from selling someone a bad product than if you're somebody nobody's ever heard of. It's effectively using reputational currency as a commitment device. But by the way, something as a Brit, which I find astonishing in India, truly amazing, okay, is you have quite extreme wealth inequality, and yet the rate of actual violent theft, I mean, I don't know, but in London, if we knew that every American tourist was carrying the equivalent of £10,000 in cash, they wouldn't get halfway down Oxford Street, right? So that, by the way, is I think is a truly miraculous quality. The fact that actually I can wander around as a Westerner in India with a very, very low expectation of being mugged. I had a friend who was the chairman of Ogilvy India, and he said he used to walk home in Mumbai after dark through very poor areas without even kind of experiencing mild concern. So that shows how certain cultures can generate high levels of trust in one field, and the ability to do business without needing elaborate legal or bureaucratic mechanisms to define it. By the way, one huge opportunity for India, of course, is the fact that the world's had a crash course in Zoom, and you have an incredibly educated, in many cases English-speaking population, and your ability to export services through Zoom. You can, as my chief executive calls it, you can Zoom ship now. That didn't happen anymore. It used to involve a plane. It used to involve meeting people. I'm talking to friends in the city, and they say, we actually are seeing people doing $30 million deals between people who've never met each other. That never happened before. And I think Zoom is really important because looking someone in the face establishes some degree of trust. Okay. Now, interestingly, you could never win business over email, and you could never win business over the telephone. But 2 years ago, my own company discovered we could win business in California or the Middle East or India using Zoom. And that has a huge, huge implication, because previously the barrier to entry in any form of speculative work was the cost of a return air ticket, 2 nights in a hotel and 4 days of your life. No. Now, is it worth all that expense if you've got a 5% chance of making, let's say, $100,000? No. It's not worth a flight and 2 nights in a hotel for a 5% chance of $100,000, okay? Is it worth 2 hours on Zoom for a 5% chance of $100,000? Every day of the week.
So, Rory, very interestingly, you spoke about Zoom shipping, perhaps one of the reasons that you could join in, from such a large distance away. And
this is a huge, by the way, this is a huge opportunity, genuinely, for anybody in professional services to export. Really, really huge. I mean, I will, in future, when I do projects for clients in Europe, the United States, India, wherever, okay, I will have, I think, a team on 3 continents. That will be the norm now.
Interesting.
Actually, specialism trumps geography once Zoom becomes ubiquitous. And by the way, can I just say one last thing?
Sure.
I think my Twitter feed is probably 50% Indian. Okay, now admittedly there are a lot of people in India, but the level of interest in behavioral science and behavioral economics in India is the greatest in the world. Okay, and my colleague Chris Graves, who runs the Ogilvy Centre for Behaviour Change, also says that this will be effectively an Indian-dominated discipline in 5 years' time, and good, I hope it will be. But this is an opportunity, actually. The Indian enthusiasm for behavioural science is actually a huge opportunity for economic advantage.
That's fascinating, Rory. One last question, if I may.
Of course, yeah.
So you mentioned, you talked about innovation. The question is that, in your understanding, is there considerable C-suite buy-in for distributed innovation across the company, or are business leaders more risk averse at this time? Another follow-up question, in your view, should post-COVID innovation in companies be linked entirely to ROI-based outcomes or include broader social objectives too?
Right. I think a lot of innovation requires conversation between different silos of the business. And I used to have a rule in advertising, which is I used to say, if you have an idea, it doesn't matter how brilliant it is. If your idea requires your marketing clients to ring someone in operations, they'll never buy that idea. And tragically, I think in business, we need to look at this. We need to have other boards, as well as the board which has fiduciary responsibility and which looks at the world through a balance sheet lens. We need businesses to have a customer board, which focuses on the demand side, not the supply side. Okay, we need to have a separate board which goes across the various silos, which focuses on emotional efficiency rather than operational efficiency. Okay, because it's a tragedy that the only time a business gets together across silos, all it talks about is money. And my colleague at London Business School, Jules Goddard, puts it very beautifully. He says a balance sheet contains 1 revenue line and 6 cost lines, and generally the conversation proceeds in exactly that ratio. 6 times as much time is spent talking about cost as is spent talking about how you might grow revenue. And so I think also in terms of innovation, you need to have ROI on innovation. I'm not suggesting it's an indulgent process. However, you need to have 2 separate modes in a business. You need to have exploit, which is probably 80% of what a business does, which is making the most of what they already know, doing what they already do better. I'm not suggesting for a second that's not important. But if you look at bees, you discover that whereas 80% of bees follow the waggle dance, they go to where they know pollen is because other bees have told them about the location of pollen. That's exploit. That's exploiting your existing model of the world. 20% of bees fly off at random, and they couldn't understand this because they said bees have been around for 20 times longer than humans. They're about 20 million years old. You remember, don't forget, a flower is merely a weed with an advertising budget. Never forget that, okay? There's a lot of advertising and marketing in nature. Look around you. But 20% of bees are R&D bees. They go off at random. Now, the ROI you have for those bees is different because most of their journeys are wasted, but when the journeys pay off, they pay off disproportionately. That's the really vital thing to remember. And so scientists modeled it as a complex system, and they realized that if all the bees did was exploit what they already knew, eventually the hive gets trapped in a local maximum. And when the circumstances and the environment changes, the hive starves to death. And so you need the 20% of bees effectively to help you adapt to changing circumstances over time. Because it's worth remembering that all big data comes from the same place, the past. And everything bees know from the waggle dance comes from the past. But if you think about it, the waggle dance won't tell them when, well, first of all, it doesn't help you much when suddenly some cows break into the field and eat all the flowers. So one source you thought of nectar and pollen, which was valuable, is now useless. But it doesn't also tell you when a field over the hill suddenly comes into bloom. So you have to make a trade-off between short-term efficiency and long-term resilience. Also, if you don't have some random bees, you never get lucky. Okay, it's a really vital effect. You've got to actually expose yourself. Nassim Taleb writes brilliantly about this. You've got to expose yourself to some random opportunities for positive, unplanned upside. So it's a trade-off, but you shouldn't use the same metrics for R&D and exploration as you do for exploitation.
Rory, that was actually a fascinating session, and it's amazing to know that 50% of your followers on Twitter would be Indian. So that's amazing.
No, this is a real thing. It's a phenomenon. The level of exploding interest. Your government, I think, has just established a behavioural insights team, which is very, very valuable. Because I'm obviously talking to my audience now, which is people in industry. This is equally important in government because, in fact, it's more important in government because government doesn't have a marketing function at all. So there's no one there to say it's just economists. Okay, and it's just rationalists. Now, actually, let's say road pricing. One of the points I told you about my father's point about how I persuaded my father to get Sky. Road pricing will be perceived very differently and will have completely different behavioural effects depending on how you present it. So these same questions will apply in government and legislation and in all manner of government and political questions. Every bit, perhaps even more than they do in business.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rory, again for sparing time.
It's a delight.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. If anybody wants to add to my Indian Twitter following, by the way, I'm at Rory Sutherland, all one word. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Rory, and we look forward to joining us later sometime.
Well, one day I'll be there physically. In fact, to be honest, I like the fact I'm not flying as much. I used to fly too much, but one of the countries I was always worth flying to was yours. So miss you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rory.
Bye-bye.